Hi, fourth grade friends. Excited to be back with you again. It's our last time for this school year. It's kind of hard to believe that it's already almost over. So this week's going to be all about mysteries. I don't know if you noticed from the front of our Google Classroom this week in the stream that I kind of did a little Scooby-Doo reference for you. So I hope that you'll think this week's pretty easy. Here's what you're going to do. I have 4 different mysteries picked for you this week, and for 3 of them, the months I'm going to read for Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, you're going to listen to the story, and then I'm going to have a question under the classwork tab in Google Classroom, and you're going to vote for who you think was the thief or the bad guy or bad girl in any of the stories. And then we will have on Thursday will be our big reveal day, and I will let you know whether or not you were right. So what we're going to be reading this week on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday is a different story from a series of books that actually I have in the library, and they're called Encyclopedia Brown. Now, one of the things I like about Encyclopedia Brown books is that I like the fact that they're short mysteries. So if you're not a person who likes to read long, long, long books, there's something that you can read really quick. Kind of like if you remember in third grade that when we read the Stories to Solve books, they're kind of like that, a little bit longer, couple pages in each one of the mysteries. And then at the end of the story, it tells you what really happened to see whether or not how good your detective skills are. So, the second thing I like about these, and you probably aren't going to remember, oh, I'm sorry, there's my dogs. Somebody must be at the front door, or a leaf blew, or somebody is walking in our neighborhood because they have to let us know about everything. One of the other things I like about the Encyclopedia Brown books are that, and I hate to admit this, they're kind of old, kind of like Mrs. O, and some of them I read when I was in fourth grade. So they're kind of stories that have been around for a while, but a good story lasts for a really long time. So today we're going to start with this book, and this is called Encyclopedia Brown and the Case of the Treasure Hunt, and the author is Donald Sobel. So we're not going to read all of the stories in the book, but we are going to read some of them because there are 10 different stories in the book, and we're just going to start with the first one. The first one is called The Case of the Masked Robber. So I want you to go ahead and get ready, kind of just get your minds open, ready to be good listeners. If you can, sometimes it helps to kind of make a picture in your head of what you think happens, and we'll get started. In police stations across the United States, the same question was asked again and again. Why did every grown-up or child who broke the law in Idaville get caught? Idaville looked like an ordinary seaside town. It had clean beaches, 2 delicatessens to get sandwiches, and 3 movie theaters. It had churches, a synagogue, 4 banks, and a little league. What made Idaville different from any other place in the world was a red brick house on Rover Avenue. For there lived 10-year-old Encyclopedia Brown, America's Sherlock Holmes in tennis shoes. Encyclopedia's father was chief of police. When Chief Brown came up against a crime he could not solve, he knew what to do. He put on his hat and went home to dinner. At the table, he told Encyclopedia the facts of the case. Usually, Encyclopedia had solved the mystery before dessert. If he needed a few extra minutes, his mother was disappointed. Chief Brown never told anyone the secret of his success. Who would believe him? Who would believe that the brains behind Idaville's war on crime hadn't yet raised the seat on his 2-wheel bicycle? Encyclopedia never let slip a word about the help he gave his father. He didn't want to seem different from the other 5th graders. But he was stuck with his nickname. Only his parents and teachers called him by his real name, Leroy. Everyone else called him Encyclopedia. Now, an encyclopedia, back when Mrs. O was little, was a book or set of books that was filled with facts from A to Z. And if you think about that set of books I have in the back of the library that has the picture on it, kind of makes the picture of, I think it's like a sunset, that would be an encyclopedia. Now we use Wikipedia online. So Brown's head was also filled with facts from A to Z. He had read more books than anyone else in Idaville, and he never forgot a word. His friend said he was better than a library for getting answers. He was never closed. On Tuesday evening, Chief Brown took his seat at the dinner table. He looked at his soup without picking up a spoon. Encyclopedia and his mother knew what that meant. There he had a case that he could not solve. Tim Crandon was robbed in his home early today, Chief Brown said. The case is a real puzzle. Tell Leroy about it, dear, Mrs. Brown urged. He's never failed you. Chief Brown nodded. He took a small notebook from the pocket of his uniform. Using his notes, he went over the case for Encyclopedia. Shortly after sunrise, Chief Brown said, Mr. Crandon was awakened by noises in his living room. He surprised a robber. Who is Mr. Crandon? Mrs. Brown asked. For 30 years, he taught tennis in Alabama. He retired last year and moved to Idaville, Chief Brown answered. He looked back at his notes and continued. Mr. Crandon saw a masked man making off with 3 of his Chinese screens. The masked man pulled a gun and tied Mr. Crandon to a chair. Mr. Crandon watched through a window as the robber loaded the screens into a station wagon and drove off. How valuable are the screens? Mrs. Brown asked. Each has 6 panels of ivory figures, Chief Brown said. Mr. Crandon has them insured for a huge amount of money. Aren't there any clues? Mrs. Brown inquired. A good one, Chief Brown said. As Mr. Crandon entered the living room, the robber saw him and quickly put on a mask, but he wasn't quick enough. Mr. Crandon recognized him, but he was afraid to say anything. The robber might have used his gun if he thought he'd been recognized. Mrs. Brown glanced at Encyclopedia as if expecting him to speak. The boy detective was not ready to ask his one question. He usually only needed to ask one question to solve a case at the dinner table. So Mrs. Brown asked a question herself. If Mr. Crandon knows who robbed him, why haven't you made an arrest? Because, replied Chief Brown, the man he recognized was one of the Enright twins, Fred or Carl. They look exactly alike. Mr. Crandon couldn't tell which twin was the robber. I don't know the twins, said Mrs. Brown. What do they do? Fred Enright was a store clerk, Chief Brown replied. Carl Enright was a top professional tennis player for 20 years. Both men are retired. Fred moved to Idaville 6 months ago. Carl followed him a month later. Each lives alone. What about an alibi? Mrs. Brown asked. Where were the twins when Mr. Crandon was robbed? Chief Brown flipped a page in his notebook. Fred claims he didn't get up until 8 o'clock today, more than an hour after the robbery. Carl says he slept until 9. Neither has a witness to back up his story. So neither has a real alibi, said Mrs. Brown. For that matter, neither does Mr. Crandon, Chief Brown pointed out. He could be making up a story about a robbery. I see. Then he can get the insurance money and still keep the Chinese screens, Mrs. Brown murmured. But why would he say one of the twins robbed him? Mr. Crandon dislikes them, Chief Brown said. They dislike him. I don't know why, but it has something to do with a tennis tournament many years ago. Mr. Crandon may have faked the robbery, Mrs. Brown said, and he's trying to blame one of the twins. Mr. Crandon doesn't have a criminal record, Chief Brown pointed out, but the twins do. They spent a year in jail in Alabama 2 years ago for stealing oil paintings. Then turn everything around, Mrs. Brown said thoughtfully. The robber didn't put on his mask until Mr. Crandon entered the living room because he wanted Mr. Crandon to see his face. Chief Brown frowned. The robbery might be a clever trick. The twins could be setting Mr. Crandon up. If he accuses one of them of stealing the screens and can't prove which one, he'll look foolish. Good heavens, what a twist. Mrs. Brown glanced at its encyclopedia again. The boy detective had closed his eyes. He always closed his eyes when he did his deepest thinking on a case. Suddenly, his eyes opened. What was the robber wearing, Dad? He asked. Dark trousers and a white short-sleeved shirt. Chief Brown answered. Leroy, said Mrs. Brown, obviously disappointed by the question. How can his clothes be important? Not all his clothes, Mom, Encyclopedia replied. just as short, it tells us who is guilty. So we have a couple choices. Do you think Mr. Crandon did it? Do you think it was one of the twins? You're going to have three choices. Think about your answer. And if you're not sure, go back and watch the story again so you can hear some more of the details that maybe you might have missed. All right, I can't wait to see which one you choose. I will be back tomorrow with another story.